Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Rachel Moy, and I'm the Director of Consumer Solutions for the Sports Science and Human Performance business here at Quest Diagnostics. And today we are very pleased to have Pratik Patel with us, presenting a webinar titled Long-Term Successes of Biomarker Testing. Pratik is the Director of Performance Nutrition and the Assistant Strength and Conditioning Coach for the New York Football Giants. Pratik is in his 3rd season with the Giants and his 10th year as a veteran sports dietitian. He is a pioneer in sports as one of the few people in the country to hold dual primary full-time roles as both the Giants sports dietitian, overseeing all nutritional aspects for the team, as well as the assistant strength and conditioning coach. He is the first South Asian and minority on a professional coaching staff in this capacity. For 7 years, he worked at the collegiate level at Kansas State, Michigan State, and the University of Oregon, where he had the opportunity to build, grow, and integrate sports nutrition departments from the ground up, and worked with numerous championship-winning teams across a number of sports with a heavy emphasis on football. Pratik also conducted one of the first high-intensity functional training studies, which has since spawned a growth of research at Kansas State in their functional intensity training lab in a number of different populations, including the U.S. Army. So we're glad to have you presenting today, Pratik. As Tony mentioned, we are recording today's program. We will post it on our the Quest Clinical Education Center and on blueprintforathletes.com, so you can view the presentation and share it with colleagues who couldn't join us for today's live program. We will take your questions at the end of the presentation, but as you think of them, please use the chat or the Q&A feature to send them to us. Pratik will address them at the end of his presentation, and we will be taking live questions when we get to that Q&A portion of the program. Also, at the end of the program, we will provide a link for anyone who's interested in trying out our product through our trial testing program. So stay tuned for the end to get the link to that trial testing registration page. So lastly, the views and opinions presented in today's program are those of our invited speaker based on his professional experience and expertise. Now I would like to turn the floor over to today's presenter, Pratik.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and thanks to everybody for the call and for being on and listening to how we are able to implement some of the Quest Blueprint for Athlete programs with our athletes. And today, what we'll be able to talk about is kind of learn how biomarker testing can help maximize player performance, and then examine how we use the BFA program with our athletes, and then lastly finish up by talking about the benefits of sweat testing for smarter performance and recovery. So training smarter, why should we use advanced biomarkers for maximized performance? Well, as a member of the performance staff, one of our main objectives is to try to keep our players as healthy as possible for the entire year. So keeping players on the field is crucial, and try not to let preventable issues cause missed games. We're only guaranteed 16 opportunities, 16 games in an entire season to have all of our players on the field. So if a player ends up missing one game, that's almost the equivalent of a normal person missing 1 month of work. So that's something that we are charged with trying to figure out, what are things that we can do from a practitioner standpoint, from a technology standpoint, and from an implementation standpoint to come up with solutions to these issues that are preventing our players from staying on the field, not only in games but also in practices too. And to help avoid some of these adverse events, monitoring biomarkers can become a critical way to improve and evaluate player health and performance. And as you see, there's hundreds of biomarkers that you could potentially test. You have acute and longitudinal markers, ones that look at muscle function, hormones, lipids, inflammatory markers, glucose control, and even immunity markers. So there's tons of things to look at, and I think one of the most important things is to try to figure out what are some of the low-hanging fruit things that you can actionably change as quickly as possible that your players can buy into, instead of chasing improvements with 100 to 200 different biomarkers. When you start chasing too many rabbits, you end up with no rabbits. And another thing to look at is just assessing and not guessing. Objective biomarker data can help reveal hidden health issues. This is one of those paradigms that we kind of go back and forth with, is looking at fit athletes versus healthy athletes. Now, fit athletes are the athletes that can kind of just get through the required training sessions and the demands that are imposed upon them, as opposed to healthy athletes, which are healthy in all different facets of their life, and they're able to meet the rigors and demands of the intense training and the games that are placed upon them. So what we want to do is make sure we're keeping our athletes as healthy as possible while also making sure that they remain fit. Now, when we're dealing with our athletes, we try to ask as many questions as possible day to day and try to get that subjective information from them, but the unfortunate circumstance is that players sometimes hold back specific health concerns or things that are going on with them, not only out of fear, but just they kind of just get set in their own ways. So, in the NFL, a lot of players, if they're not big money players, they're not on huge contracts, they might be afraid to voice things that are going on, whether it's an ache or a pain or a strain, anything along that line, because they're afraid that some of that information can be used against them. So they're obviously trying to fight to keep their place on the team. And as practitioners, we want to try to know as much as possible because we want to come up with the different solutions and the different implementations to make sure that we're keeping them as healthy as possible. So sometimes just working on subjective information isn't always optimal, but what assessing and getting this information biomarker-wise helps us do is combine the subjective feedback that we get from them with the actual data that we have from what's going on in their bodies to actually help build some conversations, build relationships with players, because this is huge at this level. Players want to feel that they trust you, that you're providing them with a benefit, and that they know that you're there for a reason. You can help them out. So what biomarker testing allows us to do is help pinpoint individual health needs for each one of our players. So then you can come up with targeted solutions to actually fix anything that might not be within normal limits. And if you're able to do that and implement it and get player buy-in, it really strengthens that relationship that you have with them. And players love to have everything individualized. So this is a special way to be able to tailor things specifically for them. Instead of just working with trial and error approaches, the biomarker testing allows us to look deeper, ask questions, make changes, and track progress. So how do we use the BFA and the biomarker data in action to help us, develop relationships with our players, gain a little bit more insight with them? Well, what we're allowed to do in the NFL is to do a blood draw during vet physicals, which happens in the off-season. So historically, we've done this at the tail end of off-season training, which we just finished back in June. So what that had allowed us to do was pretty much gather all of the biomarker data on all of our players, assess it, but by the time we'd have it all figured out, the players were already out the door during their 5-6 weeks before reporting for camp. So this really didn't allow us much time to actually make any changes, create any interventions, get any player buy-in, because once they're out the door, it's out of sight, out of mind. And then when they return for camp, we're trying to, go back and start implementing everything that they had just done with the tests we had accumulated 5-6 weeks prior. So what we've implemented this year was getting testing done earlier in the off-season in phase 1. So the second week, once the players returned, Quest came by, we were able to assess all the players that wanted to opt in, and luckily this year we had about 70% of our returning vets that opted in to get the testing done earlier, because if they didn't do it earlier, they would have to do it at vet physicals at the end of off-season training. So they had to do it one time or another. What this allowed us to do is it gave us 6 to 7 weeks to look over the information, assess what needed to be done, and then implement any specific interventions and changes that we wanted to do right on the spot. And it also let us get some baseline data on specific markers that we want to see once we start returning and doing our second rounds of testing once the season starts, to see if any of these specific markers start becoming elevated. And that's mainly more with inflammatory markers, hormone markers, because early in the off season, because training volumes are so low, we'd expect them to be at a pretty low level. When they spike for some reason, we know that when we compare it to baseline, that something's going on. We can ask questions and make inferences and come up with a solution then. This also allows players to get about 6 to 7 weeks of time to implement some of these nutritional strategies, recovery strategies, supplementation strategies, to actually see if they, feel a little bit of a benefit, but also get into the habit of doing what we recommend and are trying to teach them to do. So that way, when they leave for those 5 weeks, some of them hopefully stay on course, and then when we return from camp, they've already ingrain these habits in. So we're not trying to push them to start it from square one right when they return for camp for those that ended up getting assessed at the end of off-season training. So the goal would be to test them again in phase 2 when all of the players return and we start the season. So that gives us 4 opportunities because we're going to test once a month, September, October, November, December, on Wednesdays, which ends up being 3 days post-game day, 4 days prior to the next game. And that Wednesday is an anticipated day after an off day, which would be Tuesday. So that begins our actual practices for the week for the next opponent. So obviously, we would hope that players have recovered enough time that they spent, their off day actually doing some passive active recovery and not just sitting on the couch for the entire day where they would show up Wednesday first thing in the morning and they're super sore. So this allows us to hopefully get as much buy-in because, again, it's a voluntary option for the players that want to opt in, and it's only 4 more draws over the course of 17 weeks. So, again, the goal is to try to see how their biomarkers and how their bodies are changing over time. And with roster turnover as heavy as it is in the NFL, last year we had 36 new players. This year we've got not as many, but still a handful. We're trying to capture as much data on these players to be able to get more insights into how they work, how they operate, what their habits are, what we need to do to make changes or recommendations for them. So again, tracking biomarkers over time gives us some evidence of which nutritional protocols are working and helping, especially for the players that are doing the tests regularly and have opted and bought into the nutrition recovery supplementation recommendations that we've put forth towards them. Now, big thing for getting players to opt in is making sure that testing is easy and convenient. And we know modern-day athletes, if you don't have it right in front of their face at all times, they're going to forget about it. So it's out of sight, out of mind, not on their phone, out of mind. Their heads are always anywhere but the facility. So location is everything, and what Quest is able to do for us is set up stations outside the locker room, which is one of our highest populated areas, heavy traffic areas, where players are walking from the locker room to the weight room, from the locker room down to the kitchen, from the locker room to the recovery room, and from the locker room to the training room and the meeting rooms. So they're always going to cross that area at some point in the day, especially early in the morning. So the more they see it, the more likely they are to actually opt in and do it. So again, all of this stuff is voluntary. So if it's set up right outside of the locker room, if they're walking by, I'll ask them, have you eaten anything? Have you worked out? Do you want to end up getting your blood drawn? More often than not, most of the guys are like, yeah, I've got 5-10 minutes. So a couple minutes later, we have that data on that guy. So another important thing is getting results as quickly as possible. So, when we had over 70% of our team that opted in to do it early during off-season training, they wanted the results the next day. Well, obviously, we can't get it the next day, but within 2 or 3 days, get access to the online portal so we can start pulling that information, looking through each and every player, trying to find any that flagged for markers that were not within normal limits, putting it into our own spreadsheet, looking through, putting them on individualized sheets with recommendations of, what does it mean? How can they improve those markers, whether it's from a nutritional perspective, whether it's a diet recovery perspective, sleep, or if we need to do anything supplementation-wise. So what this allows us to do is catch them while they're really interested. If we're waiting 2 or 3 weeks to assess the results and then bring it back to the players, we've already lost 2 or 3 weeks, and we've already lost their mind frame too, because if it's not done, within 48, 72 hours, then they're not really going to be as interested in it. So we've had good success this past off season. The buy-in was great, and players were definitely trying to get their information as quickly as possible, to the point where we brought in some free agents after we had done the first round of assessments, and they saw that players were getting some individualized protocols and recovery, nutrition, and they were wondering, like, well, hey, when can I get this done? Like, well, we have to wait till vet physicals happen at the end of off-season training. But again, it's trying to strike while the iron's hot. Now, what is it that we are trying to feature in terms of the biomarkers that we're spending most of our time looking at? Again, you can look at every single thing under the sun, but if you're not trying to get the low-hanging fruit taken care of, then it doesn't really matter. So the things that we try to focus most on and then spawn everything else from there are the things that have a high nutritional component that players can easily identify and adopt, within 1 or 2 days of having their tests done. So obviously, the main ones that everyone's heard about: vitamin D, lipid levels, hormone, omega-3 index, omega-6 to 3 ratio, and some inflammatory markers. But I'm not going to go super in-depth on vitamin D because that's been well known in the research and has been a hot topic for the past, 3 to 5 years. But some of the things that we've looked at with vitamin D is obviously identifying the type of test that you're doing and how to interpret those results. There's a variety of ones you can test. You can get bioavailable, you can get assay, you can get LCMS, and understanding what are some of the downfalls and positives of each one of those tests. And also having a supplement protocol to be able to address and implement with the player right then and there, because we know that vitamin D is going to be really difficult to get through the diet to reach the levels that athletes need to maintain throughout the year. So we try to shoot to get anywhere above 40 or 50, and that's the goal. And we know that when we have players that come from, different parts of the country, that come from different teams who may not have had this assessed, then we don't know much about them. And some of them, show up with vitamin D levels in the teens. And so with that, we need to make sure that we're not just throwing too much too soon, because I know a lot of protocols have called for upwards of 50,000 IU weekly or bi-monthly. And what the research has kind of shown is when you superload that much and not do it in small incremental amounts day to day, say 2 to 4, 2 to 5,000, you overload vitamin D and you get a subsequent rise in 24-25 OH, which inhibits the bioactivity of the 125 OHD, even after those high doses have ceased. So we've had good success just trying to implement long-term solutions with players that are even in the teens, upwards of 30 to 40. So we try to have them at minimum do about 5,000 a day and try not to go a little bit higher than that. And we've had some good successful players last year that reported in the teens, retested again at the beginning of off-season training. They're now in the 30s. Now, it's not exactly where they need to be, but we're taking the steps to get them there. We're not overloading them, so we know that, these changes are positive. Also with vitamin D, making sure that you're looking at magnesium intake, vitamin K2 intake, because those are going to help vitamin D get absorbed in the body, and also getting an idea of, what are these players actually wearing on the sunny days when we're practicing outside. Athletes are going to athlete when it's 80 degrees outside. A lot of them are still wearing long sleeve hoodies, full tights, so they're not getting a lot of skin exposure from the sun. And the amount of time that we get to spend outside in the sun up here in northern climates isn't as it would be if you're looking at a state or a city down south. So trying to bring this up to the players, but again, it's going to be completely on them if they want to change the way that they dress or the attire they wear for practice. Moving on to lipid levels, assessing total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides. Some of this has a genetic component, but a lot of it has to do with quality of diet, what these players are doing on a day-to-day basis. Are they over-consuming alcohol, things of that nature. And what research has shown is that there's a strong association between tendon injury and recovery from tendon injury and elevated levels of total cholesterol and LDL and such. So these are things that we want to make sure that the athletes are aware of, especially if we have athletes that have elevated lipid levels that have had histories of tendon injury, they present with tendinitis, things like that. So we can improve that through the diet and just do a little bit of education right there on the spot. Another main thing we've been looking at is omega-3 index and also the omega-6 to 3 ratio, which again looks at diet quality in the body and also gives us an idea of just systemic inflammation. When you have these players that are constantly eating out or not eating the right things and skipping out on the healthier omega-3s and fatty acids that they can get in their diet, it shows with the results. So even though we could be asking, how are you eating, this and that, give us an idea of what you're doing, let's do a quick assessment about, what you've eaten in the past day or past 3 days. Sometimes they're not always truthful or they can't remember, but this allows us to look even deeper to get more of an idea like, all right, well, you definitely don't get much DHA or EPA or ALA in the diet. We need to do something about it. These are the food sources available. If you're not into that, we can do something for supplementation, because once they get down this road of constantly eating, that way, and systemic inflammation increases, then over time that could set them up for failure. And research has shown that based on your, I guess, ethnic background kind of dictates your ability to metabolize different fatty acids. So 50% of Caucasians are hypermetabolizers of fatty acids. 80% of Africans and sub-Saharan African Americans, their descent, are hypermetabolizers of fatty acids based on the D5D enzyme. So if you have a player who didn't come from much, had gone to a high-level school and pretty much got by eating fast food, McDonald's, whatnot, and comes to the NFL is doing the same thing, then it's obviously going to show in their assessment. But also, what is this going to do long-term for the person who, he's kind of gotten away with it just for the time being because of how athletic he is, but when is this all going to start accumulating? And these are the things that we try to bring up to our players and just enlighten them and educate them just so they're a little bit aware of it. All right, and from all of this information, we put it into the individualized reports and get a chance to talk to the players, whether it's, right after a lift in the locker room, text them and say, hey, tomorrow let's spend 5 minutes going over this information. And for a lot of them, it's the first time that they've actually learned about it or actually tried to go through it and see what it means. And a lot of these athletes are trying to do any and everything they can, especially those that are on one-year contracts or bounced around from team to team. They want to do as much as possible, and if we're able to teach them, like, this is what you need to eat, we're going to work with our chef in-house, we'll put the meals together for you, or we'll work with your meal prep delivery company or your chef or your wife, girlfriend, significant other, just to give you some recommendations on what you need to do. Now, if there's something we can correct strictly through food and the player is down for it, then we will go forward with that. But if they're a little bit hesitant and they haven't eaten a specific food or food group their entire life, more than likely they're not going to implement it just because the results are low. So then we try to look towards supplementation to see if that's a possibility. And we've had some good buy-in with these players, especially the vets that have bounced around from team to team. One of our players says that these are his nutritional correctives, just like we do movement correctives in the weight room, and it's going to try to hopefully get him to 10 years in his career. So again, we try to identify the areas that the players need to improve upon, do quick intervention, education, and then follow up with them regularly. They'll have the sheet posted in their locker, give them one to take home, and then follow up, daily and weekly just to see how things are going. Now, we'll move forward to an interesting case study. So aside from just the basic ones where you had an athlete, implement vitamin D supplementation and increase levels from 20 to 30 or from the teens to 30 or from 30 to 40, those are some of the easy things that we can do using this information. But sometimes looking a little bit deeper and asking more questions helps us find some more issues that are going on with players. We had one that had presented on Saturday during his early lifts. We do a quick questionnaire for a small handful of them that show up early, just asking from 1 to 5 what your energy level, soreness, how are you sleeping, this and that, with 1 being really poor, 5 being excellent, and kept circling 1 on his questionnaire. And this happened a few weeks in a row. And this is a guy who we don't really have to worry about. He's really low maintenance, does a lot of extra, works hard. We really enjoy having on the team. For some reason, he kept circling 1s on his card, and this was week after week. I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and looking at some of his results in the weight room too. Whether it's through the force-tex jumps, looking at power output, concentric rate of force development, things of that nature. His jump heights were going down too. And I'm thinking, what's going on? Because we were asking him, is there anything that you've been doing differently, anything that, we can help you with? And again, subjectively, he was just one of those guys that doesn't like to complain, and once he gets into a groove, that's what his new normal is, so that's how he expects to feel. So, one of the mornings, Quest was in doing the blood draws. I was like, hey, do you want to just do a quick blood draw just to see if there's anything that might be going on we can look at? And he said, all right. Come to find out that aside from low vitamin D, he had really high levels. CK was high, inflammatory markers were high, and higher than what they had been when we tested them initially, trying to get to baseline. And probed a little bit deeper and found out that all the stuff that he'd regularly been doing as means of, passive recovery and active recovery after practices, he stopped doing. This was getting later in the year, and unfortunately, if the team's not having a lot of success, then a lot of the guys just stop doing the things that they are used to doing or feel that helps them, and they start going into this preservation mode just to get to the end of the season. So found out that he hadn't been eating, doing his post-workout recovery stuff, hadn't been stretching, doing Normatec, all that other stuff. So, finally we just said, all right, well, how about you get back into your groove, make a couple adjustments, eat and drink this post-workout. These are your options for passive recovery. And then come to find a couple of weeks later that he'd felt a lot better and he'd gotten back into his groove. So again, if we were just trying to go on subjective measures and asking him what was going on, he wasn't giving us anything. Using the biomarker data helps us just kind of ask more deep questions. And then another interesting case, so we had a player that reported, with a good amount of weight gain, pain and soreness in his lower body, and just ended up looking puffy. So he had been going on like that for a week or two, and we asked him about it, didn't really reveal much. Wasn't a player who divulges a lot of information. Good kid, doesn't cause any issues, but one of the ones that we have to kind of monitor and make sure he doesn't hurt himself in the weight room. So finally, one of these mornings when Quest was here, I was like, hey, do you want to do a BFA? We can just kind of see what was going on. He said, yeah. So assessed his results, found out that his cortisol levels were through the roof, triglycerides were through the roof, well over normal amounts. And then kept on asking him questions. I'm like, all right, these are the reasons why that these results would be a little bit higher. What is going on? Is there anything that you can divulge? Well, we found out that his sleeping pattern had just become really badly. He was going through some stuff with his family and some personal issues. He divulged the information to our psychologist, but at that time it wasn't that big of an issue to where we needed to be involved. Found out that the stress that he had been gaining and the issues he'd had with his family or what was going on had been causing him to drink. So that's where we had a little bit more of the weight gain and the fluid retention, and to go along with the soreness and poor recovery. So we were able to kind of just understand what the reasons were for these issues and do a little bit of education, offered to help him in any way that he wanted to help. Just kind of put together some resources for him. He continued to work with our medical staff or psychologist, and so now he's on our radar. So now we know the issues that he had gone with in the past during last year, and we can kind of make sure that we're asking the right questions, keeping tabs on him. Now he's made progress, obviously not where he needs to be, but now we know, we've got a better idea of what's going on with him. So if he does flag again, we know which questions to ask and which directions we need to push him to get help. All right, moving on to the third thing we'll talk about today is sweat testing for smarter performance and safer recovery. So we know that performance and recovery isn't one size fits all, and what Quest has allowed us to do is gain a little bit more insight and information on all of our players. And we know the football players are extremely heavy sweaters, and it's not just the linemen, it's all the way down to your smaller skill players that can lose anywhere from 5 to 18 to 20 pounds per practice. And obviously now we're heading into camp. After a long layoff, this is a really crucial time to make sure that we know as much as we can about our players to come up with the proper interventions and recommendations for what they should do, how to hydrate, how to recover in terms of fluid and electrolyte consumption. So what Quest is able to do for us is they'll do some sweat sodium testing by using patches on the quads of our players. So what we were able to do last year was bring them in, do the offense on one day, do the defense on the next day, and it's completely voluntary to the players. And last year we had over 90% compliance, which is great. It doesn't take much time. It's in the same location that we do our BFA testing, so the players are very familiar with it. It doesn't really interfere with their ability to get out to practice, and then when they're done, it's as simple as just taking the patches off. So again, this is something that's really quick and easy, which is crucial when you're trying to assess 90 guys within 2 days if you don't have a plan in place to get it done, or if it takes too much time, or it's kind of an issue with preventing the players from getting to practice and then doing whatever they want to do after practice, which is pretty much be on their phone, then they're not going to be very compliant with it. But the sweat patches and the results we get back from it allow us to assess sodium chloride, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, so the full range of electrolytes, obviously focusing the most on sodium and chloride. And this just allows us to identify who seems to be a heavy salt sweater. We'll combine it with our sweat rate losses from body weight changes during practice to actually calculate what is their sodium net loss for a practice. And then we can create these individualized sheets and go to each player and tell them, like, all right, well, based on what the sweat patch testing told us, this is what you lose on an average practice, when it's hot. And it's kind of insightful because a lot of players will come to us and they don't know. They'll either say, I'm a cramper, I'm a not cramper, I'm a heavy sweater, or I'm not a heavy sweater. And that gives us a little bit of information to go on. But with so many new guys coming in, we obviously want to make sure that we know what's going on, especially those that we have on the team, whether it's a rookie or signed as a free agent, who we know is going to get a significant amount of playing time that we know nothing about, except they say, I cramp every game. So this allows us to really figure out what is the potential mechanism or cause, because cramping is multifactorial, and we just want to make sure we have all of our box checked, especially using this information on hot days, humid days, when the players are outside for 2-hour practice, or for incredibly hot games. We know who to target before and during and after games, just to make sure that they're keeping up with their hydration, their electrolyte intake, and not just getting lost in the shuffle. So the sweat testing, is really an efficient design-making tool that helps us be on the front end to help individualize recovery and performance for each one of our players, to help maximize that health and performance. And to go along with that, just an interesting case study, we had a defensive lineman last year who has reported being a cramper ever since high school. And whatever, he's tried everything and nothing's really worked. He's just ended up dealing with it. So obviously we wanted to make sure that we ruled out, is this guy a heavy salt sweater or is he not? We ended up doing the sweat testing on him and found out that his sweat sodium losses weren't extremely high. So it wasn't necessarily a sodium loss issue, because he's tried tons of different drinks, tons of different electrolytes, and boosted with tons of salt and whatnot, added it to his food, and that didn't help out. USG'd him, all this other stuff, everything seemed to be all right. But what the sweat test also showed was that his magnesium levels, or his sweat magnesium levels, are a little bit higher than most of the other guys. Now, it's not you're going to lose a ton in sweat, but when you're a defensive lineman and you're doing the things that he does, and he was also a player who was constantly on the borderline of making weight, not making weight, so this meant he was doing extra cardio, doing extra sauna sessions, putting on all these layers of clothing and continuously sweating. So we know that he's losing more and more and more electrolytes because he's also trying to monitor his weight. He's not loading muscle glycogen in. So there is more electrolyte losses there aside from just what he was losing from practice. So obviously it came to the point where we had to intervene with him continuously trying to lose weight by going in the sauna and doing extra cardio sessions, because it wasn't helping him overall, especially if he's having issues with cramping during practice and he can't finish. Then him being overweight isn't even an issue. If he can't finish the practice, then, we're not going to have him on the team. So we also, based on his sweat sodium rates and looking at his BFA, his magnesium serum-wise was kind of on the low end of most of our players, probably one of the lowest that we've seen. Now, that range is, up for interpretation. It's based on what the normal, U.S. population looks like, but with serum, we don't know if it's maintaining its levels because it's being broken down from bone, or is he actually getting enough through the diet. So we worked a little bit of magnesium supplementation, made sure that he wasn't overly restricting his food and trying to just sweat out to make weight, and he was taking advantage of the resources we have nutrition-wise in the building. And after we implemented those changes in magnesium supplementation, he reported no more incidences of cramping, which I thought was really awesome. And it also was a great way of showcasing how we use not only the sweat sodium and the sweat test results from Quest, but also combining it with the BFA information that we get to be able to look at these players a little bit deeper in terms of trying to figure out what is going on with them. All right, and just kind of finish up, Blueprint for Athlete is definitely a performance tool. What it allows us to do is to try to come up with smarter nutrition recommendations for what these players need based on what their individual results show. It gives us data to educate them, so puts everything together in perspective, their biomarker testing under one roof for better control, and it really allows us to open up dialogue with the players, which I think is really huge. After testing one of our players, he had spoken with his parents. His dad has had some heart issues. He saw that he had elevated lipids, cholesterol, triglycerides, low HDL, and he actually got freaked out. So, obviously made sure that we let him know that everything was going to be fine, but we were there to help him, educate him, provide him with the tools that he needed in-house to be able to slowly make some of these changes. Obviously, working to help him increase performance, advancing fueling strategies to help maximize player performance and lower injury risk. Again, doing as much as we can, being proactive to help decrease some of these somewhat preventable injuries, because, again, football is a contact sport. It's one of the most unique in the world. Injuries are going to happen, but if there's anything we can do to help minimize or mitigate anything on the field, we should definitely take advantage of. And it also allows us to have informed decision-making. So biomarker data insights help improve nutrition and training protocol decisions. So what we provide the athletes when they're in the building with us, the menus that we set, the menus that they can take home and work with their chefs, their wives, their girlfriends, significant others, whoever, it just allows us to do a little bit more and helps us continue to, push the boundaries of what we can do for the players. All right, that's it.
Thank you so much, Pratik. So now it is time for your questions. You can send them via the WebEx chat or Q&A feature, or if you'd like to speak to Pratik and ask your questions live, the operator will review the instructions on how you can ask questions. Tony?
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question on the phone, please press star followed by the number 1. Please unmute your phone and record your name when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your request, please press star followed by the number 2. One moment, please, while we wait for the first question.
All right, while we wait to see if there are any live questions, we do have a few questions that came in through the chat on the webinar. So question number 1 is from Darnell. He asks, could you expand on some of the inflammatory markers, specifically what you guys look at the New York Giants?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, we're kind of looking at things like CRP, IL-6, hemoglobin A1C, anything that shows, is there anything acute going on with the players or anything chronic? I know that Sean Arndt did a really great webinar with Quest recently, and he kind of expanded more on that. But again, with the inflammatory markers, what we're really looking at is we know that most of these players in season are going through excessive training, stress, so we expect some of those things to be elevated. Now, do we always want to make sure that we're looking at every single player and chasing it? Not necessarily, because a lot of the time, most guys should be, within normal limits, but if there is something that does pop out, those are the ones that we will try to identify and then just go back and start using that as an opening dialogue to ask questions to the players to try to figure out, what is the reason for it? Is it because of poor sleep? Is it because of poor nutrition or hydration? Is it that, they're not necessarily maximizing their active and passive recovery times? And then we can make some more guided decisions then.
Great, thank you. Darnell actually has another question. He asks, how do you handle distribution of your vitamin D? Do you handle or does your medical staff?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Based on what we're allowed to do through the CBA, that has to be prescribed, and myself and the medical staff put together the supplementation protocol based on, what we want to recommend to them if their vitamin D is 20 or below, or 10 or below, or 30 and above. So with that, we'll work with our medical docs, and we'll look at the data, talk about who is below that 40 or 50 baseline, who we want to supplement with, and then the docs are fine with supplementing with an NSF version of it, to where they'll put it in the chart, we'll prescribe it to them, and provide it to them. And that's how we end up working with distributing vitamin D.
Great. All right, we have another question in the chat from Scotty. He's asking, do the sweat skin patches need to be sent to a lab for processing?
Yeah, so after, when Quest comes and sets it up, they'll put each one of the skin patches into a vial. It gets sent away to be assessed, and then that information gets relayed back to us. So there is some time that's going to take to get the information back, but usually the turnaround time isn't that long.
Okay. Tony, I'd like to see if there are any questions any live questions for Pratik.
Thank you. We do have one question on the phone coming from Sean Gibson. Your line is now open.
Thanks. No, Pratik, Sean Gibson, actually over here at the Browns in Cleveland. So, no, I thought your presentation was outstanding. And, I will say that in particular you talk about like nutritional correctives in your case study, which, obviously you guys have done a really good job, and you talked about, being in with your psychologist and being detailed in what you guys do and understanding the situation, and the collaboration that you guys have is it's awesome. It's amazing. My question was kind of in relation to your sweat testing. I know we've done a little bit of it here with a couple of our athletes. I was just wondering, how do you guys monitor, obviously, at practice, like your guys' intake? Like, is that something that you do? Do you have staff does? Once you have their patches on, how do you monitor their intake at practice?
Are you talking about just during a normal practice, or when they're getting assessed?
When they're getting assessed.
Oh, so it's a little bit different than what some other companies do in terms of, monitoring intake. So companies like Gatorade and a few others will do like a full-on. They'll have patches on every single person. You'll monitor fluid intake during and after, and weigh everything to make sure that you have a better idea of, what the actual sweat losses were in terms of fluid amount. Again, if it would be nice if we'd be able to do that, but a lot of things kind of prevent us to do that. Our head coach, GM, they don't necessarily want an entire performance group running around the field, weighing and assessing and monitoring every single one of our players. And, we obviously want to try to get as many of our players assessed as possible. So from the patches, we'll just get sodium concentration. So obviously, sodium concentration without sweat rate isn't the best way to go, because you don't know if it's from a heavy sweater or not heavy sweater. But what we'll also do is we'll do weigh-ins and weigh-outs for the entirety of camp. So we get a little bit of a better understanding of what fluid losses are for the players. And during the hottest 2 weeks of camp, because we'll monitor that for the entirety of the 4 weeks, we'll look at what the greatest losses in fluid are from weigh-ins and weigh-outs. And then we get an idea of, what's the average for each one of these guys. And then using that and combining it with the sweat sodium and the electrolyte losses, we kind of get more of an idea of, all right, over the course of an average practice on a hot day, this is what this person loses in terms of fluid volume, but also electrolyte level. So it's, again, it's not super ideal. It's not the most, academic or optimal way of doing it, but this way has kind of allowed us to get, upwards of 80, 85 guys done in 2 days with some of the measures that we're already getting on them. And now we can really just kind of take this and use it as an educational tool, because some guys will end up looking like, well, I know I lose 10 pounds in a practice, but I'm really, low sodium sweater, so I'm not at that much of a risk as some skill guy who loses 5 pounds, but he's losing 2 grams of sodium per liter, which is astronomical. But we have a handful of guys that are like that, and they're the ones that we need to spend a little bit more attention, educating and then making sure we have everything he needs on the field for practice.
Okay. No, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Speakers, at this time, we have no questions on the phone.
Okay. We do have another question in the chat. So, Pratik, after making adjustments to player diet and lifestyle, how long does it typically take before you see an improvement in the athlete's biomarker levels and overall health?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's hard to say because some of these measures might take a little bit more time with how compliant a player is. Well, some will be saying, like, oh, I'm doing this, this, and this, and then you kind of observe them, and you're like, well, you're completely not doing that right. And that's why, we implement some of these changes or interventions quickly. We want to at least give it some time for it to take effect before we test them again, because if we provide them with nutrition and supplementation recommendations and then we test them, 4 weeks again and they haven't seen any changes in their biomarkers, then they're like, well, what's the point of me doing this? You're asking me to do X, Y, and Z, and it hasn't changed anything. I'm going to go back to do what I was doing before. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't ask, or I didn't want those players that we assessed at the beginning of off-season training again during vet physicals. One, because they're going to be annoyed that we're asking them to do it again. Two, there could be the potential of not seeing the changes that we want to see. So giving it some time. I'd say in season, since we're only doing 4 tests once each month, I think at least 4 weeks minimum in between tests should be enough. Now, some of the guys, based on the severity of their markers or non-severity of their markers, I might not necessarily want them to test every month. If it's only 1 or 2 things we're kind of monitoring, and I feel that giving them a little bit extra time and only having them get tested 2 times during the season, or recommending that they do because, again, they have to opt in and do it voluntarily, then I would have it spaced out, every 8 weeks or so instead of doing it monthly. But, again, it's kind of up in the air, and I don't think I've read anything that definitively says you have to test, every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks. It's just kind of within the time frame that we're allowed.
Okay. Another question from the webinar. What has been the most effective approach to getting players to buy into the program? You mentioned it was voluntary. And if you test your staff, what's the most effective approach to getting staff members to buy in as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Prior to us actually doing the testing, because most of the players that have been with the team for 2 to 3 years are pretty familiar with it. We only have, I think, 4 or 5 players that have been with the team for more than 2 years. So the majority of our team is kind of new to this, unless they've done it at another team or with another company through other means. So before we ended up bringing Quest in for the off season, during our introductory meetings, it was 2 slides that I spoke with the medical team about. What's the reason for us doing this and why, and what does this mean for you, or how can this help? And I think those are always really important anytime you implement something new with the team. They always want to know why and what's the benefit. So just structuring it that way, that same slide that I had that showed which markers we were looking at to try to see if we can implement some nutritional strategies. Those are the things that I put up on the screen, and I kind of went over each one of those lines. And in athlete layman terms, if your vitamin D is low, then X, Y, and Z. If your omega-3% index is low, this, and this. If your 6 to 3 is low, this, and this. But this is what we can do to improve it, and this is how much time it takes. So athletes somewhat will buy in right then and there, and the testing happened soon right after that, so it was kind of still fresh in their minds. So that's one thing we did to try to gain some buy-in. And another is, getting in contact with some of these players that have been around the league who are kind of bouncing around, that are pretty good football players but aren't signing large contracts, and saying like, all right, well, I know you have a history of this, and this. how about we implement some of these things based on what your results show, and then they start getting excited because this might be something new to them that they haven't experienced in the past, that they're open to doing as much as possible, to staying as healthy as possible, to try to get another year, because that equivalent to $1 to $3 million every year for them. So that's money in the bank. So going to those guys and using them as sounding boards to be the loud person in the locker room to say, hey, can you go tell all the other receivers, make sure that they come tomorrow morning, when they do, swing by the testing area and just get it done, and kind of appeal to them on that level. Because, again, the things that these guys care most about is money and their phones on top of their family. So just figuring out ways to connect with them. And then with our staff, we opened it up last year for our staff to be eligible, and we had a little bit of buy-in. Not everybody took advantage of it, and that's obviously something that I think can continue to be improved, because if you have your coaching staff and your GM, getting these tests and interested, because a lot of them are obviously very aware of their health, especially if they've had any issues in the past, and they might be open to, looking at changing dietary habits, recovery or lifestyle habits, but also implementing some kind of supplementation protocol to where if they get you get buy-in from them, then they can be another great piece or soundboard to tell their own specific position groups about, hey, make sure you get this done, because it does, show that it can be very beneficial. And if you guys aren't doing this, I don't know why. But that's something that we can obviously continue to work on moving forward.
Great. We do have one more question in the chat. You mentioned the frequency of athlete biomarker testing, but how often do you test each player for the sweat composition test?
So the sweat testing just happens once a year, and thinking about it, after we had gone through off-season training, again, we've got 20 or some odd rookies, we've got 15 to 20 new players on the 70-man roster, so the roster before the rookies join us. And there's a lot of unknowns, and we're not in an extremely hot environment or climate, but it does get humid up here in Jersey. That there were some practices there, I'm thinking, man, they haven't trained in this weather in a really long time. We're going to be outside for upwards of 2 hours. I don't know how the players are going to hold up, and I also don't know much about these players, so I don't know exactly what way to attack that issue if we do have somebody who, goes down with excessive dehydration or any heat issues or cramp. So the potential for testing them during off-season training is there, and that'd be obviously something that we talk about with the performance group to see, is this the way we want to go, or do we just want to default keep it during camp when we know that the players are going to be sweating quite a bit. We know the weather's going to be warm and humid, so we don't have to necessarily worry about them working up a sweat. So right now at the moment we just do it one time a year, but last year when we did end up signing some free agents after we did the initial testing and after we went through camp, and these free agents were starters for us, so either ones or twos, we brought Quest back in, and they were able to do another quick round where we got another, I would say, 7 to 10 players, because each one of them ended up becoming a starter, and again, it was quick and easy, so that was another feather in our cap for that.